Brief introduction here. So this is a presentation I gave at the 2024 Contend and Connect conference that my church, First Baptist Bolivar, puts on. My pastor, Adam Hughes, invited me to be a part of that, and I'm grateful for this. I'm just going to play you the recording, dubbed over the presentation I gave, the PowerPoint that is, with two exceptions here. The first is that when I actually did it live, the video didn't work, and that's because, as we all know, it's a metaphysical necessity that you have technical problems when you're presenting live in front of a bunch of people. The second is that there's a point very late in the presentation that I actually cut out for time's sake, and I've added it back in here. So there's a point where you can hear the recording cut out and me talking to you like this, and that's what's going on there. I just added it back in because why not at this point? We don't need to worry about the time as much as I did then. So I hope you enjoy this. Intellectual things about our faith, and that's just wonderful. So, when Adam invited me to be a part of this, he said, we're going to be talking about the Bible and how you can know it's true. And I thought, perfect, I'm a philosopher. You're going to answer that question. You first need to answer, how do you know anything is true? So I'll take a step back and do that. And then they told me, oh yeah, you're going to be speaking right before lunch. And I thought, well, that's either going to go very, very well or very, very badly. So we'll see how we do here. So first, how can you know the Bible is true? That is, how can you trust it, and or why can you trust it? Well, that's a question of knowledge. And to go into that a bit, there are some truly weird and bizarre stories in the Bible. Could we? One more. There we go. I've been struck by this a lot as I've been reading scripture stories to my kids, especially from the Action Bible, which doesn't edit out all the weird and bizarre stories, but among other ones, Jacob actually wrestled with God. Now, the theology I hold to, and that virtually all Orthodox Christians hold to, says that should be impossible. But the Bible says it happened. The ground literally opened up and swallowed the rebellion against Moses. Think about that for a moment. The ground opened up, they all fell in and died. There's some stories like this which we just don't really, we're so used to the Bible that we don't really realize just how weird, miraculous, and bizarre they are. Jonah being alive inside the fish, the many miracles of Exodus, and so on and so forth. Okay, so go to the next one, please. How can you know anything is true? Well, that's the province of epistemology. Epistemology is a sub-discipline of philosophy, which is what I study, and that's the study and discipline of how and why we know things. So, anybody got any ideas? How do you know anything is true? Shout out something. Experience. That's good. Experience, yeah. Not really. That's not very good. But that's okay. So, to get you guys thinking about this, I am going to play a trick on you that I play on my epistemology students when I teach them. I'm telling you it's a trick. I don't tell them. So, how many of you here believe if I told you that I saw Metallica play live last summer that I actually did it? Raise your hands. Okay, I've got a little bit of a reputation. How many of you would think I was lying that I didn't actually do that? Anybody? Okay, there's always one or two contrarians. All right. Now, if I told you I saw a UFO last summer, how many of you would disbelieve me? You'd think I was lying, that I was grievously mistaken, or that I was just playing the trick on you. About the same amount of people who thought I saw Metallica. Okay. And so what I want you to think about is, why are you eager to, or more willing to accept the idea that I saw a band play live than you are that I saw a UFO? Because when you start thinking about that, you're doing epistemology. Now, maybe you don't have like the terms and precise concepts, the precise terms to identify the concepts that someone like me has, but that's what you're doing. You're thinking, this claim seems reasonable to me, this one doesn't. And what I want you to think about is, okay, why? That's doing epistemology. So to answer the question, that's a picture my friend Daryl took of me before we went in to see Metallica play live last summer. And go to the video. This will be about the UFOs.
It's rotating.
Images of that rotating thing captured by U.S. Navy aircraft, sensors locking in on the target. Commander David Fravor saw it firsthand during a training mission, describing it like a 40-foot-long tic-tac, maneuvering rapidly and changing direction.
And as we both looked out the right side of our airplane, we saw a disturbance in the water and a white object, oblong, pointing north.
The object was first sighted in 2004, then similar objects again in 2015. Footage of the sightings, declassified by the military, weren't made public until December 2017 by the New York Times and a group that researches UFOs.
Oh, the video isn't playing, never mind. So this is a picture from a video that U.S. Navy pilots took back in 2004 and 2007, where they actually saw UFOs, recorded video of it, there was radar data of it, and it was well confirmed. And the way this is a trick is, what I do when I'm teaching my students is I say, how many of you believe in UFOs? And of course they all basically say, we don't. And then I say, okay, what evidence would convince you? And they usually say, credible witnesses, maybe some credible photography or video, some other evidence. And I walk them all through that and I have to be like, you've got all that evidence. Why don't you still believe in UFOs? What are you going to do about that? And they're usually kind of dumbfounded, but I'm like, now you're doing epistemology. You're thinking, what's my standard for what I believe? Why do I have it here? Why do I change it here? And that's doing epistemology. So what I'm going to do here is walk you through, and I messed up my own notes there. I'm going to walk you through a brief introduction to epistemology, hopefully only 15 or 20 minutes. I've taught a whole semester-long course about this, so I've tried to condense it as much as possible. Then I'm going to walk you through some evidence that I find very, very compelling that is not talked about very often, and then we'll wrap up. So, epistemology is not metaphysics or ontology. Epistemology is a question of how and why you know things, not what is or what things are. That's metaphysics or ontology. It is the case that right now you're sitting here listening to me. How you know that is things like you're looking up here and seeing me, your ears are letting you hear me. So that's a good way to equate that distinction. Another way is that I've often heard, fortunately this is becoming less common, Christians will claim that atheists simply cannot be moral. No, that's a confusion of these categories. God is the foundation of all morality. He's the reason why there is such a thing as morality, because he's a moral being and he created everything. But how you know what is and is not moral, well, that comes in a number of ways. Your parents taught you things. You learn it by reading the Bible. You learn it because you were cruel to somebody and then realized that was bad. I shouldn't do that. You learn it from reading good stories or seeing good movies, like say maybe The Lord of the Rings or something like that. And an atheist can easily learn all those same moral lessons, even while they're rejecting God as the ontological source of morality. So that's just, not to get into moral arguments here, which I do enjoy, but that's to help you recognize this distinction between what is epistemology and what's metaphysics or ontology. And if you can get that distinction straight, you'll be light years ahead of most skeptics, because most of them don't. So, I'm going to submit to you, you already know what it means to know things, even if you don't have the analytic precise terms to spell it out. And if I pushed you on it, maybe you'd struggle. But you know what it means to know things, because you made it here this morning. If you didn't have knowledge, you wouldn't be able to survive in your day-to-day life. So, you thought, the conference is maybe happening on Saturday. I have knowledge of that. You acted on it. You got here. If you didn't have knowledge, you maybe would have shown up on Thursday night thinking it was happening then. So, brief history of what knowledge is. Knowledge is defined as justified true belief. That comes from Plato. You might have heard of him, one of the most prominent philosophers ever. This was more or less agreed to by everyone until that guy, Edmund Gettier, published a paper in 1963 where he introduced the concept of Gettier problems. If you ever get a concept in your discipline named after you like Gettier did, that's the way you can know, oh, I've arrived. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail on Gettier problems because it's not strictly relevant. It's important that you kind of know that they exist. Has anybody ever heard of the Christian philosopher J.P. Moreland? A few people. Well, I was at a conference one time where he was talking about these things, and he said, knowledge is justified true belief. Yes, I am aware of the Gettier problem, and no, I don't want to talk about it. Well, I'm happy to talk to you about it, but it's not really relevant to what we're trying to do here, so we can just quickly move on. So, basically after Gettier, there's two camps in epistemology. There's people who say that Plato was right and Gettier was wrong, and there's people who say that Gettier was right and Plato was wrong, and knowledge is now justified true belief, plus something else, and they're arguing about what the something else is. There's an excellent philosopher named Timothy McGrew. He's a Christian epistemologist who teaches at Wisconsin State University, and he actually argues, I'd say quite forcefully, that Gettier was wrong and knowledge just is justified true belief. Now, practically speaking, what you want to do is think of knowledge as cognitive success. And what I mean by this is you have a belief, and then you act on it, and lo and behold, it works. Well, that very likely means, at least 99% of the time, you had knowledge, and the fact that you acted on it and it worked demonstrates that you had knowledge. You thought, hey, my car is going to start and get me to the church today. You went out and started your car and it got you here. Congratulations, you have knowledge, and it really is that simple. So despite what epistemologists like to argue about, justified true belief works 99% of the time. In fact, better, probably more like 99.9% of the time, because the instances that they like to argue about are very, very contrived, very, very unlikely to actually affect you in your real life, and almost certainly are never going to apply to any objections anybody brings to bear on the Bible. So, justified simply means, to define the terms here, that you have good reasons for thinking this. True is it corresponds with reality, and belief is just something you think it's true. You all have a bunch of beliefs in your mind. Some of them you know don't correspond with reality, so that's not going to work. It's true because it corresponds with reality, meaning, hey, you think you're sitting here listening to me. You are sitting here listening to me. It's true. And it's justified, meaning you have good reasons for it. Your eyes and ears are telling you to do this. You can generally trust your eyes and ears. Congratulations. You have justified true belief. You have knowledge. Now, reasons are going to be very context dependent. This is a quote from an essay I presented one time. The evidence that makes plate tectonics a good theory has no bearing and or would be very bad evidence for a theory that God rose Christ from the dead and vice versa. And I hope that's immediately obvious. If somebody says, hey, the way the ground moves shows us that Christ rose from the dead, I'd hope you give them an incredulous stare, because that clearly is not relevant to that. So, you can know the Bible is true if you have very good reasons for it. And this is in principle no different from how you know anything else. As I've already talked about, how do you know you're listening to me? Well, your ears are telling you that. Can your ears get things wrong? Can you mishear things? Oh yeah, that happens to me. But when that happens, don't your other senses tell you something's off? You hear something, you turn around, there's nothing there. It was nothing. Yeah, that happens. So the vast majority of the time, you can trust your senses. I don't really have time to go through the other epistemological theories, but I'll do that if you want to talk to me about it. So, on to takeaways. Instead of walking you through like 4 or 5 hours where I build up to this, I'm just jumping ahead to make it easier on you. Doubt needs to be justified the same as belief does. That is because doubts influence your actions the same as belief does. There's a wonderful lecture by this guy, the late great Dallas Willard, called How to Be a Morally Responsible Skeptic. If you just Google that, you can easily find it. He coins the term irresponsible disbelief. And what his argument is, and he gave this 30 years ago, but it's even more relevant now, is the vast majority of disbelief in our culture is irresponsible because it's simply assumed you don't need to give reasons for your doubt. The person who believes, they need to give reasons, but the person who doubts does not. And he says that's intellectually and morally irresponsible, because if you really doubt something, that's going to influence what you do. It's kind of a silly example, but if I was driving here and my car's low on gas, there's a sign for a gas station, and I'm like, I doubt that that gas station has gas. Am I going to stop there? No, it influences what I do. And so what you can take away from that is a skeptic needs reasons for skepticism just as a believer needs reasons for believing. And I can demonstrate this with an even better example. Let's suppose that your significant other comes to you at some point and says, I really doubt that you actually love me. And assuming you react appropriately, you'd probably be like, okay, why do you doubt that I love you? And they get an incredulous look on their face, kind of scoff and go, I don't need to give reasons for my doubts. Well, clearly something's very wrong there. So a skeptic needs reasons for skepticism just as a believer needs reasons for believing. If somebody's going to come to you and say, I doubt the Bible is true, say, okay, you need to give me some reasons for that. And apply that in your own life. Like, you're doubting some aspect of Scripture or something at one point. Stop and think, do I have good reasons for my doubts? Or is this because I've had a bad day and I only got 2 hours of sleep last night? Think about it. Now further, most objections you're going to find to the Bible are miscategorizations that sound much worse than they really are. That is, they're misunderstandings and ignorance. For example, the Bible is not filled with contradictions. You often hear this claimed. It's simply not true. This is some basic logic here. A contradiction is if A, then necessarily not B. That is, if A is true, B simply cannot be true. And if B is true, A simply cannot be true. Examples are things like a square circle or when somebody says this sentence is false. True contradictions are extremely rare, and if you actually find one, it's almost impossible to answer. Conversely, a contrary is if A, then not B, and if B, then not A, but both of them could be false. The world religions have contrary, not contradictory relationships, and this is easy to demonstrate. I believe Christianity is true, and Islam and Buddhism are false. So, if Islam is true, Buddhism and Christianity are false. If Buddhism is true, Islam and Christianity are false. But both Islam and Buddhism can be false at the same time. That's what I believe because I'm a Christian theist. That's a contrary, not a contradictory relationship. If it was a true contradictory relationship, one being false would necessitate that the other is true. Much, much rarer, much, much harder to answer. So, there are problems and contraries in the Bible, but this is okay because you can answer problems and contraries. These are not contradictions. Here's a few examples that I just came up with from my own research. Christ seems to get the name of the high priest wrong when you compare the Gospels to Samuel. There's differing stories of Paul's conversion in Acts, and the author of Kings seems to get his math wrong when he's talking about a building project. Well, you can give possible answers to all of those. There's explanations that can be posited. If these were true contradictions, you couldn't do that. Contraries and problems can be answered. It's not a big deal. Tying into that, what I also encourage is, I like this term, the yes and response, which is somebody will say something like, the Gospels were written 30 to 60 years after Christ. Yes, and? That is, most of the time when people say things like that, they haven't actually thought through, well, why is this a problem? And something like 30 to 60 years after Christ, that's not a problem. That's when you compare that to other ancient documents, that's actually astoundingly good. Or the ending of Mark is an original. Look in your Bible, there's a little notation that says that. Well, yes, and why is that a problem? Scrap the ending of Mark. Hey, you've still got Christ is divine. He died and rose from the dead for our sins. So why is that a problem? Further, the reason why we know that that's likely the case, the ending of Mark is an original, because that's how good textual scholarship and historical studies are now, and guess what? All the rest of Mark passes that with very flying colors, so you can be even more assured of that thanks to the knowledge we have. And this last one, well, my friends have heard me go on rants about this, but I'll try to be, not do a big rant, but just because you find one problem doesn't mean all is lost. You need to appropriately triage issues. Paul said, if Christ is not risen, our faith is in vain, not if the author of Kings is bad at geometry, our faith is in vain. So there are the vast majority of objections, even if you grant them their full force and really think about it, it doesn't warrant throwing up your hands saying all is lost, Christianity is not true, full stop. This one irks me because I've read so many stories of people who've lost their faith or have deconstructed their faith, and when you look at what their primary reason is for doing so, it didn't warrant any of that. Now maybe it warranted adjusting their theology a little bit, thinking about things a little differently, but it didn't warrant saying, none of this can be true, I have to go be an atheist. In all other areas of life, we'd call someone stupid for doing this, and I came up with a fictitious example. Fortunately, it's a fictitious example to demonstrate this to you. If I came to you and I was hyper angry and I was like, my wife lied to me, so I'm going to divorce her. We've been married 10 years, we have 3 kids together, but she lied to me, I've kicked her out of the house, I've blocked her phone number, that's it, I'm done with her, I can't trust her anymore. Hopefully you'd stare at me like, well, that seems like a bit of an overreaction, but maybe you'd give me a little grace and be like, okay, what did she lie to you about? Oh, well, I'll tell you. She told me she was going to stop at this restaurant and get a Diet Coke, and I found out later she didn't stop there. She stopped at a different restaurant and got a Diet Pepsi. She lied to me. I can't trust her anymore. Again, I hope you look at me kind of incredulously and be like, wow, that's really, really stupid. Because it would be really stupid. It'd be intellectually irresponsible. It'd be morally irresponsible. But the vast majority of the time when I read about people who said, I found problems with the Bible, so I had to abandon my faith, they're doing exactly that. I wish I could find a kinder way to say this than call it stupid, but I'm kind of blunt and I can't think of one. So point being, even if you find an objection or a problem that you can't deal with, don't throw everything away. That's ridiculous. That's dumb. Now, at the same time, don't hear what I'm not saying. Scripture is the inerrant, inspired Word of God, and I'll argue with you about that. What I'm trying to do is give you a framework whereby you can deal with problems as they come up and react in a morally and intellectually responsible way. You sometimes hear people make claims, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, that's ridiculous. It's so obviously false, it's silly. If I told you I won the lottery, well, that's an extraordinary claim. All I need to do to demonstrate that is, and I don't have a lottery ticket in my pocket, but pull out a piece of paper with numbers on it. There's nothing extraordinary about a piece of paper with numbers on it. And part of the reason why I did the UFO example is, if I told you 15 years ago the US government had classified video evidence that Navy pilots had sighted UFOs and took video of them, you'd have said, that's nuts, that's a conspiracy theory. Go on the internet now. It's been released. You can find it. It's not a conspiracy theory. That would have been considered a massively extraordinary claim, but all it took to demonstrate it was a little bit of evidence. So what you want to do is develop a consistent standard for how and why you believe things. You already do this in practice. You probably just haven't sat down and spelled it out. The reason why you want to sit down and spell it out is doing that will enable you to do it better. The same way that almost everybody knows how to run, but if you actually practice it, you'll be able to run better. That's what you want to do with epistemology. Doing it better, spelling it out like this will enable you to better realize, oh, I doubt this thing that I should believe, or I believe this other thing that I should doubt. So again, I'm jumping ahead a little bit to help you, but with the Bible, you should believe what it teaches if you have good reasons, and that's typically going to be evidence, that it is consistent and it does not directly conflict with your other background beliefs. So, on to the evidence section. Well, what is evidence? If you're my kids, it might be something you want to destroy or hide. They do that a lot. Or it's things that police collect, statistics and data, testimony, documents and records, observations and experiments. Or as Thomas Mertner said, that which provides a ground for belief or theory. Now, evidence is very context dependent. There's the same quote from me again demonstrating that. Most evidence that you're going to find is actually direct or indirect testimony. That's from Thomas Reid. He's a Scottish philosopher who came up with a theory. The big point of it's called common sense realism, but that's the main point of it. So, has anybody in here ever actually met or been in the same room with President Biden? Anybody? Okay, how do you know he's the president? Testimony, direct or indirect. You read news stories, you watch the news, which is hopefully a little better than just reading news stories, but not always. The point being, you know that's the case due to testimony, and that's perfectly fine. The vast majority of the things you know through direct or indirect testimony, and that's perfectly fine. So, if the Bible matches the evidence we have, that's a good reason to trust it, especially if the details are frivolous or hard to get right, and this is even in places where we have poor or little evidence. So what you want to do is look for a smoking gun or corroborating evidence, since we're typically talking about things that happened in the past. So, for example, most Egyptologists will tell you the Exodus didn't happen, and they're going to say the reasons for that is we have little or no evidence. We don't find documents that have Moses' or Joseph's name on it and things along those lines. Now, Egyptologists are experts. Let's take them seriously. But I argue this is actually not true. For example, we know from historical evidence that the Egyptians actually lied in many of their own records. There's data where we know the Egyptians lost this battle, and when you go read their records, they're like, oh, we not only won, we beat them badly. And further, we also know that many of the Egyptian records we have left are the equivalent of political propaganda for the Pharaoh. When the Pharaoh would build a big temple, he wouldn't write on there, this is the daily log of the government administration. He'd write on there how great and awesome he was. So, given those two facts, how likely is it that the Egyptians would have actually recorded these slaves took over everything and basically wiped us out and left? Not very likely. Further, there are actually large gaps in our knowledge about ancient Egypt. There's periods where we don't really know what happened. Now, we do have better records of ancient Egypt than we do most other ancient civilizations because they endured so long, but there's still areas where we're like, we don't really know what happened. And complicating that, sometimes pharaohs, for various political reasons, would actually try to wipe out all record of their predecessors. So, there is internal evidence in the language and words used in the Old and New Testament that I think is very compelling. So to set this up, words and language change over time. I got my undergraduate degree in English because I love literature. Well, Beowulf is considered the first example of English literature, and the Canterbury Tales were written about 400 years after that, and they're both technically written in English. Good luck trying to read them if you don't read a translation, because English has evolved, the language has changed since then. Further, as another example, take the stories of Robin Hood. The original ones are probably from somewhere in the 14th century. Then compare the Disney movie, the early 90s one with Kevin Costner, and the one, they've made some other ones since 2010, but I haven't actually seen them. I only saw the last one with Russell Crowe. Well, the point I'm getting at here is, this is a story that's within our cultural lexicon, because ultimately our culture kind of comes from England, for good and bad. Well, just watch these three movies. You see it reflects the cultural sensibilities of the time in which those movies were made. Just watch the one from 91 and 2010. You can easily see this is a movie from the late 80s, early 90s, and the one from 2010 is more contemporary modern. You're going to find anachronisms in the way people speak, the way characters act, and things like that, because we're recontextualizing and recoloring this story, even though it's an old story, as we tell it. And you can see that very easily in this example where there's all these retellings of Robin Hood. So, looking at the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the secular scholars will tell you it's 2 sources mashed together, one of which dates from 950 BC, the other one to about 500 BC. And they were mashed together and edited together during the Babylonian exile. If that is indeed the case, what we should expect to see is Old Iranian borrowed words, because Old Iranian was the language spoken in Babylon at the time, and some Babylonian ideas and customs working their way in, and little or no Egyptian words or customs in there, because they're several hundred years removed from Egypt at that point. Instead, what we see is little or no evidence of Babylonian influences and plenty of Egyptian languages and customs. And then you actually find Old Iranian in other parts of the Old Testament, which would have been composed during or after the Babylonian exile. So, borrowed words. This is a concept which, if you haven't heard of it before, it's very easy to figure out. This is a case where a language takes a word from another language and just starts using it. English, we've got tons of them. That's why it's so hard to learn how to spell in English. So, philosophy, theology, omelet, so many of them. And that's why it's hard to learn to spell, and it took me I think I was out of school 15 years before I learned how to spell. So, 400 years in Egypt, and the Israelites will have some borrowed words. Further, if you take the story seriously, Moses would have been educated by the Egyptian aristocracy, so he would have picked up some. Now, 71% of the borrowed words in the Torah, the first 5 books, are from Egypt. There's 26 Egyptian borrowed words in Exodus that are used 333 times, 27 and 388 in both Exodus and Numbers, and 51 and 450 in the rest of the Old Testament. So to give you some more context on that, Ancient Egyptian is just a little less than 1.4% of the total words used in Exodus and Numbers, but it's 0.12% of the total words in the rest of the Old Testament. There's 600,000 words in the entire Old Testament and about 51,000 in Exodus and Numbers. So what you have there is a sample size that is 10 times as big, contains 10 times fewer instances of borrowed Egyptian words. That's quite compelling. And further, that 10 times bigger sample also includes references to the Exodus from other parts of the Old Testament. Then you go later in the Old Testament, and you find about the same quantity of Old Iranian words in books that, again, would have been composed during or after the Babylonian exile, like Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah. Now further, there are more Egyptian names in the Torah than the rest of the Bible, and there's a list of some of them. And the name Moses itself is probably a combination of Ramses and Tutmos. So what Ben Noonan says is this affirms that the names is appropriate to the time when the events of the Exodus and the surrounding narrative took place. It'd be remarkable if the scribes writing later had not placed among these 40 names some that were unique to the later period. Meaning he's saying, hey, look, if it really was the case that this was all edited and mashed together during the Babylonian exile with little or no prior connection to an actual Exodus story, how did some Babylonian names not slip in there by accident? Why did we wind up with a bunch of Egyptian ones? I mean, maybe he could have got Moses, Miriam, or a few other ones right, but how did some Babylonian names not get in there by accident? Further, look at the context of the Exodus story. It says, a new pharaoh who did not know Joseph arose. Well, there's a period of the Egyptian history called the Hyksos, where the Hyksos were an invading foreign power that came in and took over and ruled Egypt for a while. That's probably who the pharaoh was when Joseph came there. Then the native Egyptians rose up, kicked out the Hyksos, took back over their country, and you have a new pharaoh who not only didn't know anything about Joseph, but if he did, he'd probably be like, this guy helped our oppressors. I don't want anything to do with him. Makes perfect sense. Pharaoh could actually meet with Moses and Aaron in the same day. You don't notice this unless you read the text carefully, but Moses and Aaron would meet with the Israelites. They'd go meet with Pharaoh in the same day and go back and forth. Well, at the time, P. Ramses was the capital, and that was very, very close to Avernus, where there's evidence of a Semitic population, i.e. where the Israelites probably lived. The Pharaoh is not named when you read Exodus. It just calls him the Pharaoh. Egyptian documents from this time period referred to the Pharaoh by title instead of by name. They didn't call him Pharaoh Ramses or Pharaoh Seti. They just said Pharaoh. That practice changed later, where they would refer to him as Pharaoh so-and-so. And if you read other parts of the Old Testament later, like in Kings and Chronicles and stuff like that, when it talks about the Egyptian Pharaoh, you actually see that practice reflected there, where they call the Pharaoh by name. So now stop and think about this. It would be almost impossible for scribes writing 500 to 1,000 years later to get these details right. Archaeology didn't exist before Christ. So what that means is it's very reasonable to argue the Exodus story goes back to a real event that happened in Egypt about 3,500 years ago, and it was recorded by someone Moses, during the events or shortly thereafter, because he's getting all these details right that it's extraordinarily difficult to get right. And in that vein, let's look at the New Testament now. Names are very hard to get right. Haven't you ever forgotten somebody's name and it's embarrassing? It's happened to me quite a bit, and usually I just try to avoid speaking in a way where I have to use the person's name and hope that they'll say it by accident to me or something like that. So I'm going to task you with writing a story set in France, Germany, or Central America 100 to 150 years ago. You get to pick. Can you get the characters' names right? Further, I'm going to say you've not only got to get them right, you've got to get them right in the right proportion, meaning how many people are going to be named, how many women are going to be named Sarah? How many people are going to be named Claudia? How many men are going to be named John? How many men are going to be named, my name, Phil? Well, that's going to be very, very hard for you to do. And maybe you could do it now with an awful lot of research. But could you have done it in 1st century AD Roman world? No. But both the names of the Old Testament and the New Testament fit with other ancient documents. Now, we know what people's names were in the past, thanks to contemporary archaeology, the names recorded on things like bone boxes, ossuaries, ancient historians, gravestones, and such like that. And from this we know that Jewish people actually had different names in Greece, Rome, and Alexandria, Egypt, than they did in Palestine. Further, both skeptics and believers will argue that the Gospels and Acts were composed outside of Palestine. They were written away from where the events actually happened. Now, to give credit where credit is due, I did not come up with this argument or all the data. That was actually compiled by this guy, Peter J. Williams, but I don't think this data gets enough airtime, so that's why I'm putting it out here. So, as I said, we have a pretty good idea what people were named in Palestine or Israel. If you want to dig into the real heavy academic stuff, those are two sources you could look at. I think the top one is like $400 though, so I wouldn't recommend buying that because that's how crazy academic works are published. So my contention here is, if frivolous details match and the author didn't have easy access to those details, then it's highly likely the account is reliable and true and based on eyewitness accounts. So this is a list of the top 12 or 11 names in Palestine during the time period of the 1st century AD. And you can see the sources there, the New Testament, Josephus, Ossuaries, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, what Peter Williams did is he compiled this and said, hey, the top two men's names are Simon and Joseph. We know in Israel proper at that time, that was about 15.5%. The Gospel and Acts, it's 18.2%. Difference of 2.6%. Very, very close. Not only did the Gospel authors in Acts get the names right, they got them right in proportion. You expand that to the top 9 men's names, the difference shrinks even more, which is what you would expect. As you increase the sample size, things are going to get closer together. Now, with women's names, it's a little bit off, because you can see the difference there is 10%, and when you increase it, it actually jumps up to 11. And the explanation of that is women didn't have as much of a variety of names in the 1st century Palestine AD as the men did. Maybe they weren't just as creative at how they named women. We could find other explanations. So it's not as good a match, but it's still a reasonable match. Further, just to compare this even more, you can see this is the top 6 names, and you see the descending order of the number of individuals who are named that in the New Testament. The only one that's off there is Lazarus or Eleazar, because we only have the one Lazarus, but apparently that was a common name at that time period. Then the next one, I just put them together like that so you can see and compare that you've got an excellent match between not only the types of names, but the quantity of names that the Gospels and Acts record. Further, as a control group, let's look at what Jewish people were named in Egypt. Well, Eleazar and Joseph are the only ones that compare and transfer. I'm not aware, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, is there anybody in the New Testament named Papias or Sabbatias? I don't think so. It's just not there. That's because these were based on eyewitness accounts from the time and that they were reported to be written in. If you're a Christian scribe writing in Egypt, how are you not accidentally going to put one of these names in there by mistake? And that compares them again, so you can just see that there. Okay, as another example of this, another control group, we can actually look at what the names are in the Apocryphal or Gnostic Gospels, which we know are, if not entirely, mostly legendary and mostly made up, that are dated from the 2nd century or later. The Gospel of Thomas here fares the best, but not that well. As you can see, it's only got about, 7, 8 names, and they're all the popular ones that you would actually expect. The Gospel of Mary doesn't even bother to call Jesus Jesus, it just calls him the Savior. And then the Gospel of Judas is beyond awful at this point. You've got Judas and Jesus, and then the rest are heavenly figures that have absolutely no connection to any historical record at all that we can find. So the point being, you want to do a control group, you want to know what legendary things actually look like, there you go. Now imagine this, you're an educated Christian scribe writing outside of Israel, Palestine, 30 to 60 years after the crucifixion. You're Peter, James, John, or maybe somebody they were dictating to or something like that, and you're recording the events of Christ's death, life, death, and resurrection. How are you going to get these kind of frivolous details right unless you're recording eyewitness accounts? That is, you're an eyewitness yourself if you're like Matthew or John. You're talking to eyewitnesses like Luke said he did, and they're just telling you, oh, this is who was there when Christ gave his Sermon on the Mount, this is what was said, and these are the people who were there. Now, a concept called disambiguation actually adds to this. That is, when two people have the same name, we need a way to distinguish. Now, we do this with last names. That's why I'm Phil Culberg. Or sometimes, when I was in college, we would do this with jokes. That's Brian 1 and Brian 2. Oh, I met you second, so you're the old Aaron, that kind of thing. Now, they didn't have last names in first century Palestine. So, this was the list of the disciples from Matthew 10. The number is the ranking of the name if it's in the top 99. Simon, the most popular name. Well, he's called Peter, and he has a brother named Andrew. That's a disambiguator, so we know which Simon you're talking about. James, popular name, 11. Well, he's the son of Zebedee. And John, he's disambiguated by being James's brother and also the son of Zebedee. Philip, my name. Not common. Everybody knows who Phillips is. We don't need to disambiguate that. Same thing with Bartholomew. We all only know one Bartholomew. Why would we add a disambiguator? Thomas and Matthew. Well, Matthew, number 9, popular name. He's the tax collector. Everybody knows who that tax collector was, of course. James, another popular name. Well, he's the son of Alphaeus. Disambiguator. Thaddeus, not popular, no disambiguator. Simon, most popular name again. Well, he's the Canaanian. Disambiguator. Judas, popular name, well, he's Iscariot and the guy who betrayed him. Now, we all know who you're talking about, as opposed to just any old Judas. Now, you even see this in dialogue or narration in the Gospels. Look at the story of Herod and John the Baptist in Matthew 14, where John the Baptist gets beheaded. When the narrator is writing, it just says John. Every time Herod or somebody else is in speaking, and you get the quotations to indicate it's dialogue, they call him John the Baptist, because they need to know which John you're talking about. John is a popular name. You look in other parts of the Gospels, you see this with Jesus and the crowds as well. The Gospel author seems to just assume you're going to know which Jesus he's talking about, which makes sense since you're reading a book about him, when he's doing narration. But when the crowds are talking about Jesus, when other people are talking about Jesus, they'll use a disambiguator, like calling him Jesus of Nazareth. Now, the data on these statistics was only published as recently as 2003. And what this means is, what we have here is a text from first century Palestine or Israel, or at least one that's based on eyewitnesses from then, because someone from another place and time simply could not have gotten this right. It's all but impossible. So what Peter Williams says, if the Gospels have correctly gotten the detail, that's the hardest sort of thing to remember right, isn't there every reason to think that they could have got the other things right? Story bits, who was with whom, where they went, what they did, that's easy compared to getting names right, but we're finding they got the names right. And so I was thinking of an example as to why this is such compelling evidence, and here's the analogy I came up with. When I was in the military, I did communications, and we would encrypt our communications where we had a digital key, and then whoever we were communicating with on the other end had a digital key. The idea being, hey, even if somebody can intercept our communications and they've got the same equipment, without the key, you can't decrypt it, so it's worthless. Well, what we have here is essentially something that's a bit like an encryption key that lets us authenticate the Gospels and Acts, because you have the Gospels and the Acts author Luke recording the type and quantity of names. Then about 2,000 years go by. If we're going to be technical, it's more like 1900. And nobody had access to that information. And nobody would have even thought to look for that kind of information. Now, thanks to the work of archaeologists, scholars, and historians, we can now know, oh, this is the way people were named in 1st century AD. This is how many people were named John and Simon. And it gives us an authentication key to look back and say, oh, these are eyewitness accounts. This is something that goes right back to the 1st century Palestine. And so somebody is going to say to you, well, no. The Emperor Constantine and those people made this up in like 200 or 300 AD. Impossible. There's no way they could have got this detail right. Well, legendary embellishment crept in. No, impossible. If there was legendary embellishment, it would have affected the names too, as we see with the Gnostic Gospels. well, textual corruption leapt in because copying and recopying, and that ruined everything. No, impossible. Textual corruption doesn't corrupt selectively. If there was textual corruption, we'd see evidence of that in the names, and we don't. And further, to take this analogy a little bit more, we would there's different levels of encryption. And so if like, the only detail we had was, hey, there's a disciple named Simon. Well, that wouldn't be very compelling. It's the fact that it's getting all this massive amount of details right that's what's so compelling. Just the same as if you've got like weak 8-bit encryption versus strong 128-bit encryption. So here's the point where I'm cutting in. So for some context here, let's compare this to, say, ancient philosophical texts and one historical text. The philosophical texts are the ones I study. Socrates, everything we know about him is indirect because he wrote nothing down. There's actually a place where Plato reports that he was ambivalent or didn't like the idea that people were going to write things down about him because that would change the message. He thought people needed to study and memorize things, and if you could rely on the written word, that would make people lazy, which is kind of interesting given how now people are worried that AI is going to make us lazy. Further, the primary source we have of Socrates is Plato. There's some other secondary sources like Aristotle, and some other people quote him a little bit, but Plato is the primary source, and he's very muddled, and that's because everyone who studies this agrees, this is about as uncontroversial a fact about Socrates as we can have, that at some point in Plato's writing, he stops repeating what Socrates taught and starts using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his, i.e. Plato's, own ideas. So there's like early Plato where it's thought that we have kind of an authentic Socrates, or at least mostly one, and then later Plato where it's like, no, Socrates didn't say these things, but Plato's reporting that he did. And the idea behind that, loosely speaking, is that most people who study this think that Plato was not deliberately misrepresenting Socrates. It was more like, well, if Socrates hadn't died, this is where he would have gone. This is the kind of things he would have taught. And that was kind of accepted as a non-malicious thing to do at that time period. And yet, given all this, we know what Socrates taught. That is, he taught some maxims like, I only know that I know nothing. We know some facts about him, like that the ancient Athenians executed him after he was accused of corrupting the youth and atheism. He was a hoplite. He died when he was relatively old. Apparently he was a stonemason. We know events of his life. There's a whole method of philosophy, the Socratic method, which is just questioning, that's named after him. There are certain issues, because our picture of him isn't completely clear, but there's no accepted scholar or philosopher, at least none that I'm aware of, who argues that we don't know anything about Socrates, that he didn't exist, that the sources are too muddled for us to make sense of him, and things along those lines. And despite these problems, I have a book on my shelf that's over 300 pages long called The Religion of Socrates that is just on the theology of Socrates, what he thought about the god or gods, depending on how you read him. Now compare that to what people say about, say, the biblical text, and you'll see, wait a minute, the biblical texts are often judged on a completely different standard. Similarly, with Aristotle's works, the vast majority of them are lost. What we actually have are essentially lecture notes that were not originally intended for publication. This is part of the reason why Aristotle is hard to read. We know from other historical sources that Aristotle did write dialogues akin to Plato, but those are just gone. If you ever find one of them, you've found something extraordinarily valuable, so hang on to it or give it to me or something, because I would love to have read Aristotle's dialogues. I imagine they were amazing. For a period of about 300 years, we do not know who had Aristotle's works, what they did with them, or anything about that. They just kind of disappear from the historical record for around 300 years. We know for a fact that they were edited by people other than Aristotle, at least once, possibly more times. They were translated between languages at least 4 times, and for example, when they were, in a certain sense, rediscovered by the Europeans in the, I think, early Middle Ages, I forget the dates off the top of my head, but basically, when the Roman Empire fell, a lot of works were lost, but some of them were actually preserved by monasteries and libraries in the Far East, i.e. the Islamic world. Well, after the Crusades, when there was contact established more between Europe and the Islamic world, they brought those texts back, and scholars in medieval Europe started looking at them again. Well, they had to translate them, often using intermediary languages. They wouldn't translate them straight from Arabic to, say, English, French, or Spanish, or or Latin, because Latin was the scholarly language at the time, they would use an intermediary language, so they'd like translate them from, say, Arabic to Spanish, then to Latin. And that we know for a fact that that happened. And yet still, we all look back at Aristotle and say, well, he discovered the laws of logic, or formulated them depending on what your views of laws of logic are. He taught the golden mean, he wrote all these things, and so on and so forth. Our view of who Aristotle was and what he taught is, for the most part, remarkably clear. Again, there are some issues, but no one who's knowledgeable about Aristotle, ancient philosophy, or history really disputes very many of the facts of the matter. And even though this is kind of outside of my area of expertise, I cite this example because I love Roman history. We know Julius Caesar wrote his commentaries on the Gallic War. This is when, before he became the first de facto emperor of Rome, before the civil war that led to that, he was up in what's now France and Germany, basically conquering everyone that he could lay his hands on. Now, we know for a fact that this was actually written as political propaganda. He did not write this as an objective historian. He wrote this and sent it back to Rome as political propaganda to make himself seem great. And he makes some claims in this that seem prima facie ridiculous. He brags that he killed 1 million people and enslaved 1 million. He claims that he attacked a settlement of 430,000 people and lost no soldiers in the victory. There was a dual siege at the Battle of Alesia where he finally managed to beat the Germanic, it was either Franco or Germanic general Vercingetorix, who had been his primary opponent. The story is that he tracked down that's where Vercingetorix was holed up, was in that city. He took his forces there and laid siege to it. Vercingetorix managed to get word out, hey, I'm besieged here, come help me. And all these other barbarian forces came out to attack Caesar. And then Caesar had his forces build another further siege encampment to protect themselves from those other forces. So he was sieging a city while he himself was besieged. And lo and behold, he managed to win. Well, to my knowledge, no credible historian doubts the Gallic Wars. That is, nobody reads this and says, oh, this didn't happen. Caesar was never in Gaul conquering all these people. He never fought these battles. It's, to my knowledge, a well-accepted historical fact that all these battles happened. Now, it's widely regarded, I believe, that Caesar exaggerated, but the events themselves are believed and credible. Like, people would say, okay, maybe he fought that battle where he attacked a city with 430,000 people and he lost very few men. But not that he lost no one, or maybe he exaggerated the amount of people he enslaved and killed, and things along those lines. So again, just compare our records of, say, Socrates, Aristotle, and what we know about Caesar, and look at how people then turn around and critique the biblical text. The reality is, if these three people were judged by the same standard that a lot of people like to judge the biblical text, they'd say, Socrates was a myth, we know nothing of consequence about Aristotle other than that he existed, and Caesar just flat out lied, and we shouldn't believe in the Gallic Wars at all. At least that's probably what you would hear from most people. Yet you don't. The point is, we're judging these other people, these other historical figures, by a different standard than a lot of people like to judge the biblical text, and you should not do that. You need to develop a consistent standard and do your best to stick with it until and unless you have a reason to adjust your standard. So, what you need is a good and consistent standard of epistemology, and I originally had a section here comparing this to other ancient documents, but this was too long, I had to cut it. So, a good standard that fairly includes ancient figures like Socrates and Aristotle, people I like to study because I'm a philosopher, or Caesar, I study that just because I like Roman history. That'll give you the bulk of the Bible as reliable ancient documents as well. In fact, the evidence for the Bible is even better. Everything you've ever heard anybody complain about as to why they can't trust the Bible, that's absolutely true of the sources that give us Socrates and Aristotle. Nobody I know of in my discipline questions whether Socrates or Aristotle existed or what they said and taught. There's some legitimate questions that we debate, but nobody's anywhere near as skeptical of them as they are the Bible. So why should you believe the Bible's true? Well, because there's good reasons and evidence to think so. And if you have a consistent standard that will disqualify the Bible, you're also going to need to throw out Socrates, Aristotle, Caesar, and many, many other ancient events that pretty much everybody says actually happened. So, extra resources if you want to look into this more. I have looked very, very hard, and to my knowledge, there is not a good introductory text to epistemology that's also not outdated, unfortunately. Now, I could point you to good introductory texts in philosophy, not epistemology. All the ones that I'm aware of actually assume you already know some stuff about epistemology. So your best bet, if you want to learn more, go look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's on the internet. Their article on epistemology. You might struggle through it, but I think if you tried, you could probably get it. I would highly recommend you look at that lecture by Dallas Willard I mentioned called How to Be a Morally Responsible Skeptic. It's very, very poignant even now because, as he argues there 30 years ago, so much of the disbelief in our culture is not warranted, is not justified, and is irresponsible. And he even says, look, if you're going to be a skeptic, I'm going to give you your due. You need to assume the burden of proof for your skepticism, just as I'm assuming the burden of proof for my belief. And so that's very poignant. Peter Williams, who has an excellent lecture called New Evidence, the Gospels were based on eyewitness accounts. That's where I took all this name data from. If you really, really want to dig into epistemology, which I can understand if you don't want to, but there's an excellent book called Just Epistemology by Robert Audi. He's a Christian philosopher at Notre Dame. I use that to teach, but I actually usually supplement it with a lot of stuff because it's a fairly high-level book. Peter J. Williams has a book called Can We Trust the Gospels? That one's a pretty introductory text. You shouldn't have any problem with it. And again, if you really, really want to go in depth and go nuts, look at the historical reliability of the New Testament by Craig Blomberg. It's expensive and it's about that thick, but you can't go wrong with that. So, as I wrap up here, let me just say, if you are someone who struggles with doubts about these kind of things, I'd encourage you, come talk to me, come talk to somebody. The worst thing you can possibly do if you have doubts is just keep them to yourself or repress them. Come talk to me or somebody else, and I'd be happy to engage with you on them, and I'm sure anybody on the pastoral staff here would be as well. So that's what I got. Thank you.